You know, there are moments in history that change everything. But what about the moments that almost changed everything? Back in 1962, the world held its breath, literally teetering on the edge of total annihilation. This is the incredible story of how one man, deep beneath the ocean, single-handedly stopped it.
Just imagine it. You're inside a sweltering Soviet submarine, totally cut off from the world. Your captain, Valentin Savitsky, just gave an order to launch a nuclear torpedo at the U.S. Navy, an order that would have, without a doubt, kicked off World War III.
That day, October 27, 1962, it's now known as Black Saturday. It was, and this is not an exaggeration, the single most dangerous moment in all of human history. And the fate of, well, billions, it all rested on 3 men inside a submerged metal tube. So the question is, how on earth did one of them find the courage to just say no?
Okay, so to really get what happened in that submarine, you have to understand the bigger picture. The Cold War, it wasn't just about spies and ideologies. It was this incredibly high-stakes game of nuclear chess. And the pieces were getting closer and closer to checkmate.
The dominoes really started to fall in '57. Sputnik goes up, and suddenly, the Soviets prove they can hit targets from far, far away. Then, 2 years later, a socialist revolution in Cuba puts a Soviet ally just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When the CIA completely bungles the Bay of Pigs invasion, it just pushes Cuba right into the arms of the USSR, setting the stage for the final, terrifying move in 1962.
So check this out. The U.S. had already placed its Jupiter missiles in Turkey. From there, they could hit Moscow in just 16 minutes. The Soviet response? They secretly sneak their own missiles into Cuba, which could now hit Washington, D.C. in only 13 minutes. Think about that. The entire world was living on a 3-minute difference between seeing a missile launch and, well, total destruction.
And then it happened. October 14, 1962, a U.S. spy plane flies over Cuba, takes some pictures, and the clock officially starts ticking on the most dangerous 13 days in modern history.
42. This is the number that just absolutely floored President Kennedy and his advisors. The Soviets hadn't just sent 1 or 2 missiles as a threat, no. They had managed to smuggle 42 nuclear warheads onto that island, right under America's nose. And here's why Kennedy didn't just order an immediate invasion, even though his generals were screaming for it. The CIA's intelligence was just catastrophically wrong. They told him to expect maybe 5,000 Soviet troops. The actual number? 43,000. Kennedy's distrust of his own intelligence, a lesson he learned the hard way at the Bay of Pigs, probably saved the world from walking right into a nuclear trap.
So instead of an all-out invasion, Kennedy gets clever with his words. He announces a quarantine around Cuba. Now let's be real, it was a naval blockade in everything but name. But calling it a quarantine was this brilliant strategic move to kind of de-escalate the language while still flexing military muscle. But it was a move that would push both sides even closer to the brink.
This is serious. For the first and only time in American history, the military was moved to DEFCON 2. You had nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air 24/7. 100,000 troops were gathering in Florida. This was not a drill. This was the absolute final step before all-out nuclear war.
And all of this insane tension, it all came to a head on one day, Saturday, October 27th, a day when everything that could go wrong started to go wrong, all at once.
First, a U.S. spy plane gets shot down over Cuba by a Soviet missile. The pilot is killed. The pressure on Kennedy to retaliate becomes almost unbearable. At the same time, secret back-channel negotiations are happening, but they're moving at a snail's pace. But here's the thing. The most immediate danger wasn't in the White House. It wasn't in the Kremlin. It was lurking, completely silent and undetected, deep beneath the waves.
The conditions inside the B-59 submarine were just hell on earth. I mean, this was a sub built for the freezing Arctic, and now it's trapped in the Caribbean. Temperatures soared to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with toxic levels of CO2. And crucially, they hadn't heard from Moscow in days. With all the American military activity they were detecting, the crew was convinced World War III had already started. And right there, in that isolated, hellish pressure cooker, one man's traumatic past was about to become the entire world's last hope.
So this is how it worked. To launch their special weapon, a torpedo with the same firepower as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, 3 officers had to agree. They each had a key. The captain, Savitsky,
He gives the order to fire. The political officer agrees. Then all eyes turn to the third man, Flotilla Chief Vasily Arkhipov. So what made Arkhipov different? Well, just 1 year earlier, he was an officer on the K-19, a nuclear submarine that suffered a catastrophic reactor failure. He personally witnessed his crewmates die these slow, agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning. He didn't just know about nuclear power in theory, he knew intimately what it did to human beings.
So as U.S. ships are dropping these small, non-lethal depth charges to try and force the sub to surface, Captain Savitsky panics. He thinks they're under full-scale attack. But Arkhipov, with the memory of K-19 burned into his mind, he refused to believe the worst. He calmly argued, no, these are signals, not attacks. He stood his ground against his furious captain, and he refused to turn his key. He chose reason over pure panic.
Arkhipov's single act of defiance forced the submarine to surface. The immediate crisis was over. But you know, for the man who actually pulled the world back from the brink, there was no hero's welcome waiting for them. Not even close.
Just look at this. It's unbelievable. Kennedy, who showed such incredible restraint, was called weak and soft by his own generals. Khrushchev, who agreed to pull the missiles out, was kicked out of power a couple years later for humiliating the Soviet Union. And Vasily Arkhipov, the man who literally saved the world, he was shamed. His own superiors told him it would have been more noble if he'd gone down with his ship.
This whole thing was the ultimate test of a theory called mutual assured destruction, or MAD. It's the simple idea that nobody would be crazy enough to start a nuclear war because everybody would lose. But what this story really shows us is that the so-called logic of MAD can be shattered in a second by bad information, by extreme stress, by simple human error. We weren't saved by some foolproof system, we were saved by one person.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty chilling thought. You see, Arkhipov's decision, it wasn't logical. Based on the information his crew had, the logical choice was to fire that torpedo. He made a human decision, one based on trauma, empathy, and maybe even hope. So as we start to build automated systems and artificial intelligence to manage our defenses, you really have to ask, what happens next time? What saves us when the most logical decision is the end of the world?